Are we recording?
We are recording.
Oh,
We've
okay.
been recording. We recorded the prayer. It's not going in the podcast. It wasn't that good. All right. So welcome back.
What?
Come on. We're starting a podcast. Welcome back to Resisting Pretense, where we have honest conversations about a life of faith in modern culture. And we hope to sharpen your thinking and inspire faith-infused conversations. I love that phrase, faith-infused conversations. That this shouldn't be stuff we just talk about at church. This should be stuff that's just in our lives. And we are unofficially sponsored by Diet Coke,
Since we're both drinking Diet Coke
Mhm.
at this point, so
which is a little bit lost on a podcast. But if you catch the bootleg of the video version, then you can probably see that there.
and if you are a marketing agent for Diet Coke, we'd be happy to take free donations so we can just say your name on the air.
I know a guy.
I know a guy.
All right. Well, today our focus is on the phrase "know thyself." I ran into that phrase probably in college, studying. Coming across Socrates and Plato, and it was a common phrase in Greek philosophy. But I think it has a strong tie into a life of faith. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Just that power of clarity, of understanding your strengths, your weaknesses, and what that brings into the life of a follower of Jesus. So Scott, I hope you learn a lot about yourself today.
Well, it kind of flips it on the ear of, people would say, well, you don't know what you don't know. Well, the flip side of that is I also know what I know, and the more I know about myself, the more I can engage with a holy God.
Yeah, I was in a conference, and it was a huge part of the conference I was at was about kind of self-evaluation. There was this guy there, his name's Dave Rhodes, and I quoted him. I wrote down this thing that he said because I loved it so much. He said, "You can only give as much to God as you know about yourself." That's like, wow. That is like, there's some profundity there. Like, I started chewing on that and thinking, we talk about giving our lives to Jesus, but if you fundamentally just don't really self-reflect much, if you don't think about your own thoughts and feelings, and you just kind of like living just kind of off the cuff, then you're really only giving to God as much as you know about yourself.
There's a philosophical, that could be a philosophical phrase on its own that we could discuss because
Oh yeah.
on the one hand, I only know what I know or what I've, as you said, reflected on or that kind of thing. God knows everything about me, 100%.
Absolutely.
And so the more that he exposes himself, the more he exposes me to myself.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this whole idea of like, I say to you, God, I'm giving you everything, but only actually God knows what everything looks like. And so in part of the process, he's feeding back to you these things you need to understand about yourself
So is
that
God,
aren't always easy to hear.
so is God kind of up there going, yeah, not
Yeah,
quite.
You think you are. Yeah. This whole process takes, I think, a significant amount of humility to do it meaningfully and well.
And honestly, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So you and I were talking, was it last week? It was last week. This is this is the kind of off the cuff stuff that we do. But last week we were talking about this success formula, again, something I kind of saw at a conference and took and adapted or whatever. And this idea that many people measure success by like your knowledge and your skills lead to your success, and then people kind of a nuance of that. Well, yeah, your knowledge and your skills, but really kind of it's multiplied by your attitude. If you have a really great attitude, it can really amplify your knowledge and skills and lead to even greater success. And I don't know if I'd ever really seen it as a formula before, but it was kind of expressed that way. But then this guy at this conference said, yeah, but it's all kind of divided by your dysfunction. There's this, and if you can picture a mathematical formula with knowledge plus skills times attitude, and then divided by dysfunction, um, I there was another big kind of aha moment for me of how much our dysfunction, our insecurities, our blind sides undermine even our strengths, undermine the things that we're trying to do in our lives. They undermine um, the effectiveness that we can have, um, because they're often things that we're not even that aware of.
So if we had a dry erase board, we could write it out on a dry erase board. But
Right.
if you were going to put it into an example or practical terms, what would that look like?
Okay, so I'm a pastor, and I there's certain knowledge about, say, like the Bible that I have, and maybe because I'm a pastor, I want to develop some skills in counseling or coaching people, and then let's say I have a let's say I have a reasonably good attitude. I'm a reasonably positive person, and so you would think that with some good knowledge of the Bible and some good skills toward counseling, coaching people, and a decent attitude, that would lead to a relatively productive pastoral ministry. Um, but I know many, and you've probably met some of the same guys I have, who, as a pastor, they have a fundamental insecurity in them about being respected, and they're actually quite insecure, and so they're very um they're always kind of hunting for that compliment or hunting for that approval from people, because they want to be seen as constructive and as men of God, and all that kind of stuff. And so what happens is you get into a situation, and as soon as there's conflict, the pastor might disengage because he has the knowledge and the skill to be able to lead someone through conflict. And he's got a good attitude, like, hey, this is resolvable. But underneath all of that, he doesn't have the security in his own kind of ability to actually take people through that difficult conflict, because he's too worried about offending someone or hurting feelings or be, being perceived as though he's taking sides or whatever. And so he doesn't engage in the conflict because that thing under that dysfunction of not being secure enough undermines everything that he would be capable of doing. Does that answer
Yeah,
your
yeah,
question?
I think that gives it a good thought. The scenario that was actually even running through my mind as you were talking was even that person who comes to know Jesus, reads the Bible, is getting to know more and more about God, has a good attitude in all of those things, but then there's this underlying dysfunction of maybe hurt or unforgiveness or um, confusion, that kind of thing. That you
Mm.
know, they're they keep wondering, why isn't their faith greater than where it should be, and it's because of this. Whenever you think of I can do plus and plus and plus and plus all day long, but if I'm divided by something, it
Takes a big
decreases
chunk
it.
out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it compounds the decreasing of it, and that
Hmm.
that even sounds more confusing than it was before.
Well, and I think it's the from a mathematical point of view, um, dysfunction as a divider, as a denominator, really expresses its power over our lives. That what your blind sides are undermining you in ways that you don't even understand. You don't see it happening, and it's not just insecurities. It can be, sometimes it can be, pride or arrogance. That's this dysfunction that you're not aware of, that you come off like a jerk and as a know-it-all, and you have great knowledge, you have great skills, you think you have a great attitude, you think very highly of yourself. But the problem is that you think so highly of yourself that it becomes a dysfunction, and people don't want to listen to you. You're not effective in people's lives because you're so arrogant. You're perceived as just a jerk. And so I think there's that dysfunction doesn't necessarily have to be insecurity. It can be a number of different things. It can be wounding. It can be hurt. It can be, um, you know what? Oh, you're okay.
So Can I jump off the offensive diving board?
Oh yeah,
Okay,
please. I love being
because
offensive.
because what you're defining for some people, what I'm going to suggest is going to be offensive because they are so um, engaged. But
Hmm.
I look at former President Trump
Oh,
and
okay.
has done some really pretty amazing things. I mean, I think there's some really good policies and things that he put into place, but his uh, his
Demeanor?
his demeanor, but and a lot of the stuff that he came out like on Twitter that was so offensive and so
Mm,
hurtful to people was a dysfunction that really kind of hurt his chances at a second
yeah.
term.
His lack of a
His
filter.
and so his success was stifled by this this not this uh what's that bottom part called?
Dysfunction.
Yeah, but the
Oh,
denominator,
yeah.
the denominating dysfunction of that really hurt him in so many ways.
I agree. And I like you said this could be offensive. I think just because politics is such a charged topic. But I agree with you. There are things, and I'm not a highly engaged political person. I pay attention to headlines, but I don't like get obsessive about politics. But there are things. So I didn't get deep into to the the Trump presidency, as some other friends of mine have. But there are things that he did that I thought were good ideas, and there are things about kind of his general political bent that I agreed with. But I got to a point where I couldn't stand him because of just other issues, what I would consider dysfunction issues of his just like, you know, his brashness that went beyond confidence to arrogance. And then I just click, like I tune it out and wasn't interested. And so I think his effectiveness, especially as a politician, is in keeping a group of people behind him to support him so he can stay in office. Like he didn't get a vote from me mostly because of those dysfunctions. Even though there were a lot of things I agreed with, I just like I couldn't get past some of the other things.
Exactly, and I think that that's a piece of and this isn't obviously not a political program, but it's a good example of on a global
On a
scale
big picture.
how that kind of looks. But if we were even to bring that down to a smaller scale, you and I were in the conversation, and and I was thinking about a particular couple while we're having this
Yeah, we
conversation.
both counsel couples.
Yeah.
That's a part of the pastoral gig,
And
and
so, we
sometimes the difficult part.
but so we're dealing with husbands and wives, and they're trying to be good faithful followers of Christ in their marriage,
Hmm.
and so they want success in their marriage. We all want, a good marriage that you get to the end of whatever that marriage looks like and say, I've had a good marriage in my life.
Right.
But there is this dysfunction that undermines all of the stuff we're trying to do well in our marriage, are either our own personal dysfunction or our dysfunction as a couple
Right.
can create that difficulty in success. It was interesting. I was having a conversation, actually using this formula the other day,
I saw that.
and
We have a conversation preparing for this podcast. And then I walk by a conversation he's having with someone else, and the formula's out on the thing. And I'm like, wait a minute. Did I get credit? I want to know.
I
Is that,
actually,
is that
well,
just straight up plagiarism, or did I get credit?
it was this came out of a conversation with Tom and I. Is that enough credit
All
for
right,
you,
that's fine.
or would you
That's
like the
fine. I
copyright
didn't
law
come
out of
up with it
that?
anyway. I stole it from someone else, so
But
guilty.
one of the things we talked about, which is really common in a lot of marriages, is the idea that one person is a procrastinator and the other
Mm,
person is very detailed and driven. And on their own, they're not necessarily a problem,
right.
but you put them into a marriage and that becomes a dysfunction.
Oh, that's the fun of in dysfunction.
Yeah, until they end up in our office and
Yeah,
we're
that's
trying
right.
to figure it out.
That's right. I Yeah, and I think A lot of times it has not always, but often it has little to do with the marriage dynamic. It might be a dysfunction you carry from your childhood. Like there was a wounding or a hurt, and so now when you hear your partner, your spouse say to you something, you're filtering it through that hurt, and you're making assumptions about what your partner is saying or doing that is undermining everything you're trying to do together in your marriage.
Correct.
And then some of it is the way, like, sometimes when your partner is says something insensitive to you, it's because you're oversensitive from your past, but sometimes it's because your partner is insensitive to you. And so trying to weigh out, this is where knowing yourself and knowing if you're prone to to being highly sensitive gives you an opportunity to minimize that dysfunction and really engage with your partner in a constructive way in saying something like, "Hey, you said this to me. I took it as a dig. Is that how you meant, like, I need to know, is that how you meant it, or was that a or was that something else?" And sometimes just by acknowledging that, you're able to have a far more constructive conversation. Like, no, that wasn't a dig. That was just a, like, I think everybody's like that. I don't think you're bad. So I think sometimes that self reflection, that self knowledge allows us to move past a lot of unnecessary hurts and conflicts.
Well, and to flip it on its ear is the same thing on the other side, where the person who is insensitive, when they begin to really reflect on and be able to say, okay, we were never a touchy feely sensitive, we were kind of a we're just going to hurl everything in our family and whatever happens happens. That doesn't work in my marriage. Now I've got to think back about, do I need to become more sensitive to my spouse? My dysfunction is part of what's creating this controversy in our so how do I start dealing with that
Hmm.
so we are more successful in our marriage?
And if you keep distilling this down to like the personal level, we went from big picture, global politics to marriage, and now just down to the individual person in their own spiritual life and relationship with God. If they are unaware of things like guilt or shame in their life, and they feel like, you know what, I know I'm saved, but only barely, because I don't understand how God could really love me, because I have a hard time loving myself. And if you have somebody who has a lot of that emotional baggage of guilt or shame, they assume that they're like a second class citizen in the kingdom of God, and they assume that there's not much God wants to do with them. He's just kind of graciously letting them kind of hang out in his kingdom, and are missing, because of that dysfunction, because that's a dysfunction. That's not true or real. Like, none of us have a reason to be more confident in God's. We all come as beggars to his throne, like, all of us.
Absolutely correct.
Um and and so he lifts every one of us up and has a plan and a purpose and a calling for us, that if you're stuck in shame, you could entirely miss what this opportunity to be a part of what God is doing. Um, and so, it applies in so many ways. This whole idea of knowing yourself, and the value of that, and the value of, you know not just knowing your weaknesses, but also knowing your strengths so that you can thrive in those. But a lot of times it's the weaknesses, that it's the strengths that we kind of know, and the weaknesses often that we can be oblivious to. So how would you rate yourself on a know thyself scale?
Is this 1 through 5, 1 being the greatest and 5? Give me the scale.
Uh,
Give me the rating. Or
let's
you just
go.
want
Let's
to?
go 1 through 5, with 5 being I know myself really, really well.
I would probably. I think it's hard for anybody to actually go a 5. Um, I because that would be, you know,
You sound arrogant.
yeah. Well, and the reality of it is that I think that I'm uh, fastly approaching my sixth decade of life, and the more I
Do you
thought,
speed up as you go downhill like that?
well, I don't know. All I know is the brakes don't work as well. Um, I think that that as I've gotten older, the more I've realized there were things that I thought I knew about myself
Hmm.
that all of a sudden I'm realizing I either had a wrong view or I've learned something more and deeper about
So, in the great
myself.
wisdom of your maturity,
Oh wow, that was a diplomatic way of saying you're old.
you've learned that the process never actually stops.
I don't think the process ever stops. And in fact, I think that some of the things I've learned about myself have become, I may have known them at a younger age, they've become richer as I've gotten older
Mm,
because I've begun to understand them better. Um, I have, like everybody, I have certain insecurities in my life, but as I've matured, I've also learned how to deal with some of those insecurities. Some of them I've just learned to acknowledge that they're not true. It goes back to what you were just describing
mm-hmm.
as, you know, um, going from I'm not really worthy in the kingdom of God to saying that's a lie, that I'm not worthy in the kingdom of God, but that God really views me as one of his children and that I don't have to acknowledge that anymore. And I think that came with someone helping me see that that's not true.
Hmm.
You know, um, I always have to kind of, uh, I have a tendency to sometimes be uh, self-deprecating in a funny kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I always appreciate when somebody says to me, that's really not true, and you need to stop, quote, speaking curses over yourself, unquote. And it always kind of catches me to go, okay, am I just really being funny? Am I just, is it really kind of that sarcastic, self-deprecating, or
Mm-hmm.
is there really some truth there that I need to look
That I'm
at as a
wrestling with.
dysfunction? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's good. You still haven't given me a number though.
Oh, you want a number?
Yeah.
Um, on knowing myself, I would probably say I am a strong four. How
I
about you?
um. Oh, definitely five. um.
We're still working on the maturing part.
Yeah. No, I would say like strong four, 4.5. Because I agree with you. There's always more to learn, and that you can't arrive in this process. You can just be engaged in this process, and you're gonna keep learning new things. And I think you know, perspectives shift, in different seasons of your life, and you have to be aware of how things are changing in your heart and your attitude, and hopefully if you're growing in your knowledge and skills, you need to be aware of where you're growing stronger. So this is an ongoing process. um I only say, like, I have I think one great person to thank for this space in my life, and that would be my wife, for one thing. um who has a more natural ability to just reflect and to dig in and to ask questions and kind of probe and see where people are at. And so she brought that into my life through our relationship. And so um but then I would hear this stuff in leadership conferences and stuff, and I was very attracted to it. So I would say over the last 10 years or so, this has been a big deal to me. So 10 years ago, I would tell you I was probably more at a 3, like, but today I would say I'm strong, but just because over these last 10 years I've invested a lot. I've read a lot in this space. I've obsessively, done little inventories and things to kind of, and I've compared them, what does this one say about me, and how's this one different, and what does it tell me? And, was I in a sometimes I've taken the same inventory twice to see if the results are different, if I'm in a different mood when I take it, and
So it's
I
interesting because I think that that old saying that denial's not just a river in Egypt, is that
Can't
idea
believe
that
you said that on our podcast. That's so cheesy.
it is, but at when I was at a 3, it was that probably that knowing that that dysfunction was there, but not willing to go back, going back to what you
Mm.
said, to honestly and
Okay, I
humility
forgive you for
looking at
denial
it.
now.
And at that point, when I was able to say, okay, that dysfunction is there and I need to do something about it because it's
Mm-hmm.
affecting this, that's when that knowledge jumped from a 3 to a strong 4, 4.5, was my willingness to go, I am being held back by this.
And I think that's the starting point of of self knowledge. That's the starting point of really growing in this space. You have to have the humility and I guess the courage. Um, we talk a lot about courage at Stone Ridge, and kind of one of those 4 banner qualities of like these are the kind of believers we want to build here. People that have courage, and that's not just courage to go engage with other people. Sometimes that's the courage to dig deep into yourself.
Yeah. So I'm going to put a shameless plug in right here
All right.
because you said courage is one of those things we talk a lot about at Stone Ridge. So for those of you that aren't uh, uh, familiar with us, um, Tom is the lead pastor and I'm the associate pastor at Stone Ridge Church here in Yuma, Arizona. And so when we talk about Stone Ridge, we're talking about the church that we are associated with.
Right, right. And the shameless plug would be, if you live in Yuma, you should really go to Stone Ridge Church. Unless you have another church you are happily connected with. Well, no, unless you have another church you are connected with, I wouldn't even say happily. If you're not happily connected in your church, then you should figure out why and talk with your pastor, minister, whoever, and try to resolve that.
Because
Um,
honestly, and just to go
yeah,
back
because
to
there
what we're
might be a
talking about,
dysfunction that's
well, but it might be a dysfunction on their part, but it also might be a dysfunction on
right.
my part that's preventing me from connecting to that
Mhm.
church.
So that first step of humility, courage, humility, to really take a hard, honest look at yourself, um, is can be exciting when you discover things about yourself. You're like, I've always known that about myself, but I've never been able to put it into words. And that, like, those moments are really exciting. But then there's also some difficult moments where you got to wrestle with something like, yeah, that's true. you know?
Sometimes those ahas aren't as
Mhm.
angelic as we'd like them to be.
That's right. That's right. Um, so to me, that's a first step, is just like the get in the kind of the gut space to be willing to engage in it. I think it's a nice kind of easy on ramp into knowing yourself, to start with your strengths. And there's so many resources out there to do that. I love, um, there's an online kind of assessment you can take called Strengths Finder. I think often online you see it listed as Clifton Strengths Finder. Um, I've taken that. I've had a bunch of our staff at the church take that, and it highlights 5 qualities. It's not like, you can read good. I mean, it's bigger picture qualities, like you're strategic, or you're one of your strengths is in compassionate, the way you care for people, and so it's bigger picture things, not fine-tuned skills. But um and it takes a look at 5 of those that probably you're strong in based on your response to the questionnaire. There's a similar one, Strengths Finder, you have to pay to take. There's a similar one called High Five that's free to take, and you can take it for free. You get a response, and then you have the option of buying a more detailed report. But Strengths Finder and High Five, I like. There's another one called Standout. Same guy that was involved in, I think, the original team that built Strengths Finder, Marcus Buckingham, and great speaker, great author. He did one called Standout that, instead of 5 qualities, he's distilled it down to 2. And so, to me, some extra clarity about that. I've taken all of those. I find their results kind of interesting. And there's probably other ones. Those are just the ones I'm aware of.
How important do you think it is in that area of strengths? I mean, because I've run into people who go, I have no strengths. And then they do a strengths finder and they go, oh, I would have never thought of that as a strength, or I would have never thought of. And so I think there's a part of that that says, even when you do that, you also have to trust that God wired you with certain strengths. And especially if you're like, but I don't like that strength. Well, that that may not have been your, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like the invisible man saying, well, I don't like being invisible. I want superpowers like Superman. You know, well, that's not what you were blessed with.
Yeah. Get over it. Um,
Just go disappear, sorry.
yeah, I think, clearly in the scripture, God made us to be productive. God made us to be fruitful. And so he didn't make anyone that has no strengths. Like that's not a thing. And we know in also in scripture, in addition to just strengths of like, kind of how you're wired, who you are, um, there's the Bible talks about spiritual gifts. That's another place to invest in kind of learning your strengths. Because the spiritual gift, the way I think about it, is really it's a thing that as you do it, God just blesses it. And when you do that thing, like when if your gift is evangelism, when you start talking to someone about Jesus, you find this unusual amount of responsiveness because God's just gifted you in that way. Um, and I know people that it's just it like blows my mind the way that they just engage with people. And like I know people, we have a friend here at our church, Jesse, who will go to Home Depot and he'll be shopping and he'll be checking out and he'll just ask an innocuous question to the cashier and get their entire life story.
Oh yeah.
And like I could beg for that life story and I'd never get it. But there's something about him and the way God's gifted him that people just open up.
Yep.
And that's part of, there's I can get better at sharing my faith, but I don't think I'll ever be Jesse because that's a gifting in him and I have different giftings. So I think taking the time to kind of look at what the Bible says about gifting and try to evaluate and open yourself up to other people. That's another part of the process of just being open to input from others. Um, and whether it's in your strengths or your weaknesses or whatever, like it's not a process that you can ever fully do alone.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would agree fully with that. Because I think some people see things in us that we don't see ourselves because we're too close to it.
Right.
So when we ask somebody else, what do you see as my strengths? They're going to feed back to us things that we may never have thought of. And then if we do like a strength finder or a high five, any of those, and that clarifies that, I think there's a place where we have to go. Going back to our humility and honesty,
Yeah.
I need to then step in and trust that's where my strengths are now. What do I do with those?
Yeah, and taking like you can do a strengths finder and read the results and get excited. Like, ooh, I have this strength and be excited. But it takes a little level of courage and vulnerability to go to your friend and say, "Hey, check out these results. What it says about. Do you agree with it? Do you think it's a good summary of my strengths?" And because then you have a good friend of yours that if they're honest with you, they might say, I don't know about this one.
Right,
And you got
right.
to deal with like, oh, maybe I was kind of padding the the assessment a little bit. I was talking about who I wish I was instead of who I really am.
Well, and I think and we're going to talk about this in a minute, but there's subtleties in strengths. In other
Mm,
words, you and I might have leadership skills. One of our strengths is leadership, but how we use that leadership, how that comes out of us is different.
mm-hmm.
And so, even though the strength might say, well, you're a leader, or you're good at administration, or you're good at tasks, or whatever that might look like, there's even subtleties in that to how
Right.
that strength. And that's where
How
I
that
think the
plays out.
friends come in and go, well, I would agree with this. However, this is what it looks like in you.
Right. Right. Um, and then there's that part of this process of really kind of zoning in on um weaknesses, and it's kind of broader than weaknesses, but when you assess your personality through like a disc inventory or a Myers-Briggs thing, or my personal favorite right now is the Enneagram, um, which some people think is weird because it has a strange looking diagram, uh, but it's actually, I think, a brilliant assessment of personality. Um, those kind of things tend to tell you a little bit about strengths and like where you lean toward, but they also tell you where you're uncomfortable. Particularly the Enneagram. The Enneagram gets a little bit more into like what are these underlying um, forces in your life that kind of are pulling you away from your strengths, and I think that's why I like it so much. Is it has a spiritual component to it of saying this is your temptation is to be this way. Like if you're unhealthy, it's going to tell you what you look like unhealthy and what you look like healthy, and that's to me the value of those kind of things is they give you a side of kind of a little bit of both.
Well, and I like, and I don't, I mean, I've probably done the Myers-Briggs, but it was probably when Myers-Briggs was 3 years old. I don't know. But um, the thing I liked about the Enneagram was the shades of it. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
just this black and white that you're this personality or you're this personality, or it was kind of like, okay, this is the majority of what you have, but you have a little bit of
You might
this.
lean this
You
way or
might lean
that
this way, or
way.
it
Yeah.
might lean that way, and when you're living healthy, these are kind of the behaviors that come out, and
Mm-hmm.
you're reading them, going, yeah, that's me. And then you go, but if you're not healthy in this, or if whatever that you're dysfunctional in this area,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to look like this. And you begin reading those descriptors and you're going, oh, that's me, and that's ugly. That's,
Yeah.
and that's kind of the humility of it.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that if you've talked to anybody who's done the Enneagram, they'll go, yeah, I'm an 8 with a 7 wing, or I'm a,
Yeah.
it'd be conversations like that.
They're odd conversations.
Yeah.
So we have a friend. I don't know if you know this, but we have a friend, Wendy, who recently just finished a training process of coaching people through kind of self discovery in the Enneagram.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah, and I like it's very recent, like within the last few weeks, and I can't wait to talk to her about her experience, and I feel like it's going to add some richness to having someone in our space that has some expertise there. I'm looking forward to that. So,
Are you going to ask her about your numbers?
probably we've talked about it before because she was quite interested in it for months now or maybe years now, but just decided to kind of go into this maybe even as a career choice of just being a life coach and using this as a primary tool. And um, she has a wealth of knowledge and perspective on it already, and I'll be really interested to see what this has added to that. But
I was just curious if it was going to move the needle to
oh
4.75 or something.
shush, shush, I'm a 6 now. Um, So there's one other kind of like observation I have. We don't have to go deep into the weeds on this one. This might be a whole nother podcast, but I also think in terms of like the practicality of getting to know yourself, man, we could learn a lot from addicts. I think people successfully in recovery go through this profound self-reflective process if they're following like the 12 steps um, of recognizing where they're powerless and how they need the help of a higher power or of God to get to deal with their addiction. They do there's all these, I may be taking these jumping steps and taking them out of order, but they do like a fearless moral inventory of their lives, of where they are, and an inventory of people they may have hurt, and what of those hurts they need to go back and try to rectify. And I mean, just all this stuff that just kind of peels them open. And I have found in my life that people in recovery are some of the most honest, and they're actually quite refreshing. Like I have a lot of friends with addiction in their past, and I find them some of the most refreshing people to be around because of that level of how well they know themselves. They're comfortable in their own skin, even though they know, like, that's part of being comfortable in your own skin, is really knowing who's in there.
Well, and when we were having this whole discussion, um, one of your premises was to say that on some kind of a level, we're all addicts.
Oh
We're
yeah.
all there. There is some form of an addiction that's always our comfort zone. That's always where we go back
Yeah,
to.
there's somebody listening to this right now. I'm not an addict.
Yeah, exactly,
Like,
exactly. And it's like, I'm not addicted to anything. And it's like, well,
we all have a problem with sin.
yeah.
And it has, for many of us, it drives our lives in ways that when we can acknowledge that we are not capable in and of ourselves to solve our sin problem, but we need God's power in our lives, then we're going through the exact same process
Hmm.
that addicts go through to find healing and recovery. And so I think there's a whole nother podcast to kind of parallel um, recovery and discipleship. That would be an interesting podcast for us to do in the future. But I would say that, that's just another nuance of a place where we see knowing yourself creating incredible fruit and healing and progress in people's lives, and it's borne out. Recovery is a great space where you see that happening and the power of it.
Well, and I think it's a going back to our original formula. It is really the place where people have seen their dysfunction, whether it was drugs or alcohol or whatever it was. They realized that was the dysfunction, or that was the fruit of the dysfunction that was taking place, and then they had to take that real humble look at themselves and say,
Mm-hmm.
where is this coming from? And, you know, because it's so damaging, and it brought an end to themselves, they were more prone maybe to take a look at that. I think that when we start talking about know thyself, we have to be willing to step in that, even though it's going to be uncomfortable.
That's right.
You know, so many of us are so good at adapting that we adapt our way around the denial of the dysfunction instead of saying,
Just acknowledging
yeah,
it.
it's
Yeah.
there. What is this causing in my personal life, in my
Right.
married life, in my work life, in my social life? That dysfunction is going to again be a decreasing factor in no matter what part of my life I'm in.
Right. Clarity is priceless. Like when you can see clearly who you are and how you fit into the world, it is priceless. That's a big reason we do things like, we do a workshop right now at Stone Ridge that's all about adding clarity to what's your calling into God's kingdom. Um, those kind of things, they allow you to live day to day with a sense of purpose and focus that I think makes people brings joy to their life. And when you're fruitful, that's exciting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Very exciting.
Yeah.
Now I'm ready to go know myself.
All right, go know yourself. And we'll be back again with another edition of Resisting Pretense. Thanks for joining us, and subscribe. We would love to have you a regular subscriber to our podcast. And what else do I need to say, Scott?
Should they get a hold of us? Like, yeah, I got a question about, your whole know thyself. Should we have them, go send an email somewhere?
That's a lot of responsibility. I have a dysfunction of not wanting that kind of level of responsibility. No, the easiest way to find us is to go to stoneridgechurch.com, and there are some ways from our website you can reach out to us, and we'd be happy to respond to you there. At some point, we'll probably have an email for the podcast, but right now I don't think we do, so we need to sort our stuff out.
We're working on through our dysfunction.
All right. Till next time.
Till next time.